You understand something deeply and explain it perfectly, clearly. But the person you're teaching looks more confused after your explanation than before. That's not bad teaching. It's you falling into the clarity trap. Nobody talks about this, but every expert faces it. You've spent years understanding something. The complex became simple for you. So when you teach it, you explain it the simple way, the way that makes perfect sense in your expert brain. But the person learning doesn't have your expert brain. They have a beginner brain. And your simple explanation skips all the steps their brain needs to build understanding. You think you're being clear because it's clear to you. But clarity for experts and clarity for beginners are completely different things. You've been using your own understanding as the measure of good teaching, when the only measure that matters is whether the learner can follow the path from not knowing to knowing. And that path looks nothing like the shortcut you're trying to show them. This is called teaching familiarity bias, the tendency to teach concepts as they feel familiar to you rather than as they need to be learned by others. Studies show expert teachers consistently skip foundational steps that feel obvious to them but are invisible to learners. Your brain has compressed years of learning into automatic understanding. When you access that knowledge, it feels simple and unified. So you present it that way. This happens because expertise creates blindness to the learning process. You can't remember what it was like to not understand. The neural pathways are too strong. Your brain retrieves the concept instantly and completely. It can't recreate the slow step-by-step building that originally formed that understanding. The problem is, learners need the steps you skipped. Your brain thinks it's being efficient and clear. It's actually explaining the destination without showing the journey. Look at what happens when you're teaching someone at work. You're explaining a process you do every day. You say just do X, then Y. To you, X and Y are obvious connected steps. To them, there's a missing link. Why does X lead to Y? What happens between them? You didn't explain because in your mind there's nothing between them anymore. They're fused. Or you're helping someone learn a skill. You demonstrate it. You make it look easy because for you it is easy. They try. They fail. You say you just need to feel when it's right. But feeling when it's right is the end point of learning, not the starting point. You've given them expert advice that only works for experts. Or you're explaining a concept. You use an analogy that makes perfect sense to you, but the analogy assumes knowledge they don't have yet. You're explaining the unknown, using other unknown. Your familiar territory is their foreign country. And here's what nobody tells you about this. The better you are at something, the worse you get at teaching it to beginners. Novice teachers often teach better than experts because they remember being confused. They explain the steps because they recently needed those steps. You've forgotten what confused you. Your expertise erased the memory of not knowing. So you teach the polished final understanding without the messy construction process. The familiarity that makes you competent makes you blind to what learning actually requires. You explain clearly from your perspective. This makes the learner struggle, which makes them think they're slow or not getting it, which makes them give up or lose confidence, which confirms your belief that some people just get it and some don't. You're not just teaching poorly once, you rebuilding a pattern where your expertise becomes a barrier to helping others. Develop the same expertise because you've lost access to the beginner's experience of your field. I watched someone spiral through this exact pattern last week. Most people think this is about explaining better, so they try harder to be clear. They use simpler words. They repeat themselves. But that's like giving better directions to someone who doesn't know they're supposed to be traveling. The real issue isn't clarity of explanation. It's that you're explaining from the end of the learning journey instead of the beginning. You're showing them where you are instead of meeting them where they are. This bias survives because expert knowledge feels simple and unified. You genuinely can't see the complexity anymore. The steps you skipped aren't hidden on purpose. They're invisible to you. Plus, admitting you re-bad at teaching something you re-great at doing feels like admitting your expertise is incomplete. That threatens your identity as someone who really understands their field. And if you slowed down to teach every tiny step, you'd feel like you're being condescending or wasting time. Your brain would rather teach at expert speed and blame the learner than face how far you've drifted from the beginner's mind. But here's where it gets interesting. People who teach well don't remember their learning process better. They actively reconstruct what confusion feels like. You teach from your current understanding. They teach from imagined confusion. You ask, does this make sense to me? They ask, what would make this confusing to someone who doesn't know what I know? The difference isn't teaching skill or patience. It's deliberately stepping out of familiarity to see through unfamiliar eyes. You're trying to share what you know. They're trying to recreate the conditions that build knowing, and building knowledge is nothing like having knowledge. So the next time you explain something you understand well and the person looks lost, you'll know what's really happening. Your familiarity made you skip steps. You explained it the way it lives in your expert brain, not the way it needs to enter their beginner brain. The confusion isn't their failure to understand. It's your failure to remember that understanding feels obvious only after you have it, not before. Now you can catch it. You can feel yourself explaining and ask, what am I assuming they already know? What step feels too obvious to mention? You're not trying to dumb it down. You're just making visible the invisible steps that familiarity erased from your awareness. You started this video thinking clear explanation meant using simple words. Now you know. It means rebuilding the path you forgot you walked. That's not a small shift. That's realizing expertise and teaching ability move in opposite directions without deliberate effort to bridge them. Understanding this bias is just the beginning. There's another one that's even more powerful, and most people never see it coming. Subscribe so you don't miss the next one.